Welcome back to Parking Full Time. I am Big Dave, the Parks Professor, and I want to specifically welcome you to this Bible study and prayer time. The goal of Parking Full Time is to display the glory of God's creation by exploring America one park at a time. The theme verse for Parking Full Time is Colossians 1:16. All things were created by Him and for Him. The hiking videos are designed to display the created by Him, the created by Jesus part. And these Bible study and prayer time videos are designed to display the created for Him part. Right now we're studying through the book of Genesis. And last time we started looking at Noah. If you know even a little bit of Bible, you know that Noah built an ark that saved people and animals from the flood. And that's important, but that's not the one thing that the Bible really emphasizes about Noah. When you read the Bible's description of Noah, the things it really emphasizes about Noah, it really emphasizes two things about Noah. It emphasizes Noah's faithfulness, how he trusted the Lord, and it emphasizes Noah's obedience, how he did what the Lord told him to do. And those two things, faithfulness and obedience, are really important because those are the same two things that we need. We need to be faithful and we need to be obedient. We're saved from God's judgment of sin, namely eternity in hell, the same way that Noah was saved from God's judgment of sin via the flood. We're saved by grace through faith, just like Noah was. You see, we've all sinned, just like Noah did. And also, just like in Noah's day, God has to judge sin. Sin is such contrary to who God is, he has to judge sin. And just like in Noah's day, the penalty for sin, God's judgment for sin, is death. But Jesus, God himself in human form, lived a sinless life and paid a death payment when he died on the cross. And he's promised forgiveness of sins and everlasting life to whoever believes in him. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. That's John 3:16, the most famous verse in the Bible, probably. The only way to have that everlasting life is the same way Noah got it, by grace through faith. Stop trusting in yourself or whatever else you're trusting in, and start trusting in him. Start trusting in the death payment he paid. And Noah did that. Noah was faithful. We need to be faithful just like Noah was faithful. And after we do that, after we trusted in him, we need to be obedient as Noah was obedient. We need to do what God says to do in his word. So last time we looked at Genesis chapters 6 and 7, and we left Noah on the ark in the middle of the flood. So let's pick up where we left off. So let's start here in Genesis chapter 8. In verse 1 in chapter 8, it says, "And God remembered Noah, and every living thing, and all the cattle that was with him in the ark, and God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged." Chapters 6 and 7 were all about destruction and judgment via the flood. The two chapters we're going to look at in this video, chapters 8 and 9, are all about renewal and replenishment after the flood. And the hinge between those two things, the destruction and judgment and versus the renewal and replenishment, the hinge between those two things is right here at the very start of chapter 8, the very first part of verse 1 of chapter 8. And it's kind of the key theme for the next two chapters. It's this phrase right here, God remembered Noah. God remembered Noah. The first verse in chapter 8, when we start talking about the replenishment and renewal, the renewal of life on earth after the flood, the very first thing it tells us, God remembered Noah. Now, it's not that God forgot him in the previous chapter. God's God. He never forgets anything. This word here, the word translated remembered, it carries the idea of to pay attention to or to act on behalf of. Now, to keep this in a little bit of context here, let me refer you back to a verse we looked at last time. Let me write in a reference here. I'm going to write in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 18. Genesis chapter 6 and verse 18. And this is a verse we studied last time, and last time I promised you that I'd say a little more about it this time. And so, well, now is this time. But here's what it said here. Genesis chapter 6, I just flipped back one page to Genesis chapter 6. And God is speaking with Noah. And here's what notice what he tells him here. Genesis chapter 6 and verse 18, he says, "But with thee," again, this is God speaking to Noah, so with Noah, "but with thee will I establish my covenant, and thou shalt come into the ark, thou and thy sons, and thy wife, and thy sons' wives with thee." Again, I'm not going to say a lot about this because we studied it in detail last time. But before Noah ever started building the ark or got on the ark, God made this promise to Noah. He promised to Noah, "I'm going to establish my covenant with you." A covenant is just a special agreement. We're going to have a special agreement together. And I'm going to bring you onto the ark. You and your family, you're going to come onto the ark to be saved from the floodwaters. So back in chapter 6, God made this promise to Noah. He says, "I'm going to establish my covenant with you. You and I, we're going to have a covenant. We're going to have a special agreement." Well, now fast forward a couple of chapters to chapter 8, the first chapter we're going to study today. And so by now, it's probably quite a few years later. Noah at this point has been cooped up on the ark with his family and these animals for 150 days. And in those 150 days he's been on the ark, he hasn't heard a single word from God. At least nothing that's recorded in scriptures. Noah looked around him. God didn't seem to be doing anything. At least nothing that would benefit Noah. You see, the point I'm getting to here is we all go through times in our lives when God doesn't seem to be doing much for you. Times like this when we're sitting on the ark and we're not getting any word from God. Nothing seems to be happening. You remember the great things that he's promised to do. You remember how he's promised eternal life to everyone who believes in him. We remember how he's promised to never leave us or forsake us, for those of us who have believed in him. We remember how he's promised us spiritual blessings in heavenly places, as Ephesians chapter 1 says. Ephesians is a really good book. Maybe we'll do a study of Ephesians at some point. But you remember all of these great promises and all these great promised blessings, but yet nothing seems to be happening. And maybe Noah was having one of those times right here. And when that happens, when you have one of those times where you remember and you read about all of God's blessings, but nothing seems to be happening, it's easy to get to wondering, it's easy to get to thinking, does God remember me? Does God remember what he promised he would do? Does he really intend to do the things, the great things he's promised he will do? Again, I picture Noah and his family in the ark. Maybe Noah's thinking that way at this point. That little phrase there at the beginning of chapter 8 and verse 1, God remembered Noah. That reminds us that, yes, God does intend to do what he has said he will do. God never forgets anything. God never lacks any power to get anything done. God remembered Noah, and we're going to see in this chapter how God remembered Noah. God remembered Noah. He remembers you, and he remembers me also. It's important to remember that when you're having the rough times. Keep reading here. Some other things keep happening here. Look down at verse 2. It says, "The fountains also of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained, and the waters returned from off the earth continually. And after the end of the 150 days, the waters were abated. And the ark rested in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, upon the mountains of Ararat." Most people, this place here, the mountains of Ararat, most people think that these are the mountains north of Mesopotamia and east of present-day Turkey. I think that's probably correct. When I was a kid, a famous book and film came out entitled In Search of Noah's Ark. And I remember seeing that film and reading that book when I was a kid and a teenager. That book, it detailed expeditions to what some people claimed was the remnants of Noah's Ark in those mountains, the mountains that we call today Ararat. Those claims haven't really been substantiated. Personally, I think that any remnants of the Ark would have been destroyed by the elements over the intervening thousands of years. And so I wouldn't really expect that we'll ever find any remnants of Noah's Ark. But anyway, that's just my opinion. Look at verse 5. Verse 5 continues this theme. Verse 5 says, "And the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, were the tops of the mountains seen." So the ark rested on the 7th month, and on the first day of the 10th month, 3 months later, or 2.5 months later, the tops of the mountains were first seen. You think about what the world would have looked like as the waters started receding here. Even today, flooding is one of the worst natural disasters you can possibly have. Not only does the water do damage, which of course it does, the water damages things and kills people and animals, but the water also brings in a bunch of disease and a bunch of mud and a bunch of dead stuff. So even though the waters are receding at this point, the earth is not inhabitable yet. The coming of the waters was a sudden event. The renewal of the earth, the receding of the waters, the preparing the earth for new life, that takes a while. That takes a few months here. Look at the next couple of verses. Look at verses 6 and 7. "It came to pass at the end of 40 days that Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made." The window was probably, it wasn't the door of the ark where he and all the animals came in. The window of the ark was probably on top of the ark, so he could look up and navigate by the stars and that sort of thing. So Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made, and he sent forth a raven, which went forth to and fro, until the waters were dried up from off the earth. Now, you need a little bit of zoology to understand this in the next few verses. Ravens are omnivores. Ravens will eat almost anything, including dead stuff. And as I mentioned with the flood waters receding back up here in verse 5, at this point there would have been plenty of dead stuff laying around killed by the flood for the raven to eat. And this verse says, it says the raven went to and fro, so it went back and forth from the ark to the surrounding landscape, presumably finding dead stuff to eat. Let's continue in verse 8. Verse 8, it says, "Also he sent forth a dove from him, to see if the waters were abated from off the face of the ground. But the dove found no rest for the sole of her foot, and she returned unto him into the ark, for the waters were on the face of the whole earth. Then he put forth his hand, and took her, and pulled her in unto him into the ark." Now remember, God hadn't said anything to Noah since the start of chapter 7. The last thing that God had said to Noah was back in chapter 7, back in verse 1 of chapter 7, where it says, "The Lord said unto Noah, Come thou and all thy house into the ark, for thee have I seen righteous before me in this generation." That's the last thing God says to Noah up until what we're going to get to in a couple of verses here. So for the past 150 days, and a little more than that probably at this point, God hadn't said anything to Noah, at least nothing that's recorded in the scripture. So if Noah hadn't received any word from God, what's Noah doing here? Well, he's experimenting. He's feeling stuff out. He's trying to figure out what to do next. He's trying to figure out if it's safe to open the door of the ark and go outside. And the raven up here in verse 7, it could find dead stuff to eat on the mountaintops near where the ark was resting. Now, the dove, and again, a little more zoology here. The dove, on the other hand, the dove is a valley bird. It lives down in the valleys. And whereas the mountaintops were clear of water, the valleys weren't. The valleys were still covered in floodwaters. And so whereas the raven could find stuff to eat and could go to and fro, the dove couldn't find no rest for the sole of her foot. The dove couldn't find anything to eat and couldn't find any place to rest. So it came back to the ark. That happens for a few more days. Look up here at verse 10. And he stayed yet other 7 days, and again he sent forth the dove out of the ark. So he waited 7 days and sent the ark out again. And the dove came into him in the evening, and lo, so it had been out all day, and lo, in her mouth was an olive leaf plucked off. So Noah knew that the waters were abated from off the earth. This word here, plucked off, this little phrase is important. The fact that it's plucked off is important. So the fact that it's plucked off, so that says that it was a fresh leaf that had been plucked off of a growing tree. It wasn't some of this dead stuff like the raven had been eating. This is a fresh leaf plucked off of a newly growing tree. It wasn't some tree that was under the water, some leaf that was floating on the water. And so if there's a leaf plucked off of a newly growing tree, what does that mean? Well, that means even down in the valleys, things are starting to grow again. This was the first sign that life on earth was being renewed and that God's judgment had passed. And this picture of the dove bringing in her mouth an olive leaf that's plucked off, this imagery here, the dove and the olive leaf, in almost every culture today, those two things, the dove and the olive leaf, those are symbols of peace. Or an olive branch, those are symbols of peace. That's true in almost every culture today. And that image, the dove and the olive branch as symbols of peace, that comes from right here. When Noah saw that dove carrying the olive leaf or the olive branch that had been plucked off, that told Noah that God was at peace again with his creation. God's judgment that had come via the flood was over. Keep reading here. Look at verse 12. And he stayed yet other 7 days, and sent forth the dove, which returned not again unto him any more. So this time it found a place where it could build a nest and sustain itself. Verse 13. And it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, in the first day of the month, the waters were dried up from off the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark, and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. And in the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, was the earth dried. And God spake unto Noah, saying, Go forth of the ark, thou and thy wife and thy sons' wives with thee. Now, verse 15 and 16, these two verses are important here, because this is the first time since the start of chapter 7, since what we looked at back here in Genesis chapter 7 and verse 1, back then, God told Noah, Come thou and all thy house into the ark. So this is where God tells Noah to get on the ark. Here in verse 15, this is the next time God speaks to Noah after that. And it's the first time God had spoken to Noah since he told him to go onto the ark at the beginning of chapter 7. And so God spake unto Noah, saying, Go forth of the ark, thou and thy wife, and thy sons' wives with thee. Now God tells Noah, get off the ark. So do you think Noah's going to listen? Do you think Noah's going to do what God told him to do? Yeah, I think he will. Because, what are the two most important things about Noah? Noah was faithful, and Noah was obedient. He believed God, and he did what God told him to do. And that's exactly what happens. Look at the next few verses here. Verse 17. He says, Bring forth with thee every living thing that is with thee, of all flesh, both of fowl, and of cattle, and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. Everybody off the ark is basically what God's saying here. That they may breed abundantly in the earth, and be fruitful and multiply upon the earth. Verse 18, Noah does it. And Noah went forth, and his sons and his wives and his sons' wives with him. Up here, every beast, every creeping thing, and every fowl, and whatsoever creepeth upon the earth, after their kinds, went forth out of the ark. And again, I keep emphasizing this because this really is the most important thing in this narrative. Once again here, you see Noah's faithfulness and Noah's obedience. God told him to do something, and Noah did it. Noah trusted the Lord. Now, next here in verse 20, Noah does something that God didn't command him to do. He does something voluntarily. Look at what happens here in verse 20. Verse 20, it says, Genesis chapter 8, verse 20, "And Noah builded an altar unto the Lord, and took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings on the altar." Now, God did not command him to offer that sacrifice. Or at least if God did command him, it's not recorded in Scripture, so probably God didn't command him. This is something Noah chose to do. He chose to do it because he's thankful. He's thankful that God had spared him and his family from the flood. You see, the point I'm trying to make here, following the Lord isn't just about keeping a bunch of rituals or a bunch of legalistic rules. Although there are rules that you need to follow. You do need to keep his commandments. As Jesus said, "If you love me, keep my commandments." So that's important. But following the Lord isn't just about that. Following the Lord is about your heart. It's about your mind. It's about your will. You see, Christianity is not just a ritual religion. And it's not really a ritual religion, period. Christianity is a heart religion. And the reason Christianity is a heart religion and not a ritual religion is that God is not a ritual God. He's a heart God. He knows the thoughts and intents of the heart. Judaism, by the way, is the same way. It's just a little harder to see that, maybe. But God doesn't just want you to go through a bunch of motions, to go through a bunch of rituals. That's not what he wants. He wants you to love him with everything you have. He wants you to love him with all your heart. And Noah did that. Noah shows here he does more than God commands him to do. Noah did love him with all his heart. Look at the response his offering gets here in verses 21 and 22. Verse 21, "And the Lord smelled a sweet savor. And the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake." Again, the offering that Noah offers here, God calls it a sweet savor. The Lord was pleased with this offering. "And the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake. For the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again smite any more every living thing as I have done." And he makes a really nice statement here in verse 22. Again, this is God speaking. He says, "While the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease." As long as the earth remains, God's creation is going to keep working the way he intended it to work. God promises that here. Now, this phrase here at the beginning of verse 22 is important. This phrase, "while the earth remaineth." And that's important because there will come a time when the earth will not remain. Let me write in a reference here. I'm going to write in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 10. 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 10. I'm not going to take the time to turn there. I taught through 2 Peter at my church. I just finished doing that a couple of weeks ago. A lot of interesting things in 2 Peter, a lot of really harsh things in 2 Peter as well. But 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 10, it says, "The earth and the works that are therein shall be burnt up." It tells us the earth is going to burn up. There's going to come a time when the earth and all of the things, all of the material things that we have on this earth are not going to remain. All that fancy car you drive, it's going to burn up. That fancy house that you live in, maybe, it's going to burn up. All that money you're spending your time making, that big 401k, it's going to burn up. That fancy church maybe you're going to, it's going to burn up. God's will is going to remain, though, and God's word's going to remain. God will destroy the earth again, but he's not going to do it with water. He's going to do it with fire. And here in this verse, it's a really great promise. God promises that until then, as long as the earth remains, until the earth is destroyed with fire, the natural order of God's creation is going to continue. God's going to make sure of that. And remember, God always does what he promises he's going to do. Really great promise there from the Lord. We get into chapter 9. And chapter 9 starts in a very interesting way. It starts chapter 9 and verse 1. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. I'm going to box this word blessed again. I boxed that word several times back in chapters 1 and 2. And the reason I'm going to box that word is because most of what happens here at the start of chapter 9 is a renewal of the earth as God created it in chapters 1 and 2. There are a lot of things that happen here at the start of chapter 9. They're similar to what happened back in chapter 1, and that's one of the ties, one of the threads that hold those two passages together. The blessings that God gave back in chapter 1, and now again, God blessed Noah, that same word right here. That's one of the threads that hold those two passages together. We see more of those threads down in verse 2. Look at verse 2. He gives them the same command he gave back in chapter 1. He says, Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. Now verse 2, And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every fowl of the air, upon all that moveth upon the earth, and upon all the fishes of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. This is similar language also to what we saw back in chapter 1. I'll write down a reference here. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 28. We studied that a couple of videos ago, Genesis chapter 1 and verse 28. And that's another thread that ties these two passages together. The language you see here is very similar to the language that appears in Genesis chapter 1 verse 28. Now comes something that's a little bit different. So look at verses 3 and 4. Every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you. Even as the green herb have I given you all things. But flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, shall ye not eat. Now this is a little different from what he told Adam and Eve back in chapter 1. And I'll write down the corresponding bit in Genesis chapter 1. It's Genesis chapter 1 and verse 29. So I'm going to write down that reference. That's the part of Genesis chapter 1 that corresponds to these two verses here. And again, it's a little bit different. Back in Genesis chapter 1, God gave Adam and Eve herbs, seeds, and fruit to eat. Okay? And that's why he says this here, every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you, even as the green herb have I given you all these things. Back in chapter 1, he gave them the green herb. Adam and Eve were vegetarians. Now he expands that. He expands that to include meat, with the restriction in verse 4 that you can't eat the blood. The blood is the animal's life, so you can't eat animals that are alive, animals that still have blood in them. You have to kill the animal first and drain the blood before you can eat it. So there's a difference here. And the reason for this difference is because of what happened back in chapters 3 and 4. Back in chapter 3, sin entered the world. God had told Adam and Eve, Thou shalt not eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. He told them that in chapter 2. And what did they do in chapter 3? Well, they ate. They ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Because of that, sin entered the world. And the penalty for sin, again, God always has to judge sin. And the penalty for sin is death. So therefore, because sin entered the world, death entered the world. Probably no man or animal had died until chapters 3 and 4. Before sin entered the world, man and animals, they lived in harmony. Now because of sin, they don't. Now God gives the people, Noah and his descendants, he gives them meat to eat, in addition to the herbs that he had given them before. Keep reading here. Look at verses 5 and 6. I extends this a little bit. And surely your blood of your lives will I require. At the hand of every beast will I require it. And at the hand of man, at the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man. This is talking about murder, plotting to kill people. Murder is illegal in almost every culture. And the reason is right here. When you kill someone without a cause, it's not like killing an animal. When you kill a person without a cause, you're not just showing contempt for that person, you're showing contempt for God. Why? Well, because of the explanation here in verse 6. For in the image of God made he man. Man was created in the image of God. And so if you kill a man, you're not just showing contempt for that man, you're showing contempt for God, because that man was created in the image of God. And so you can't kill and eat a person like you'd kill and eat an animal. Man was created in the image of God, those animals weren't. Keep reading here. Look at verse 7. And you, be ye fruitful and multiply. Bring forth abundantly in the earth and multiply therein. Again, that's similar to the language from Genesis 1. And God spake unto Noah and to his sons with him, saying, And I, behold, I establish my covenant with you, and with your seed after you. This now is the fulfillment of the promise that we looked at earlier back in Genesis chapter 6. Back in chapter 6, God had promised that I'm going to make a covenant. I'm going to make a special agreement with you. Now here, he's doing it. God always does what he promises that he'll do. So he says, I establish my covenant with you. Present tense, I establish, right now I'm doing it. I establish my covenant with you, and with your seed after you, and with every living creature that is with you, of the fowl, of the cattle, and of every beast of the earth with you, from all that go out of the ark to every beast of the earth. And I will establish my covenant with you, neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood. Neither shall there any more be a flood to destroy the earth. As I mentioned back here in verse 22, at the end of chapter 8, God will destroy the earth again, but it's not going to be by water, it's going to be by fire. He's going to keep the promise that he makes here to Noah. Look at the next few verses, and these are the last few verses we'll look at today. Verse 12. And God said, This is the token of the covenant which I make between me and you, and every living creature that is with you, for perpetual generations. Says this is the symbol that we have an agreement together. The symbol that of the promise that God made, that he won't destroy the earth again by waters of a flood. So here's the symbol, verse 13. I do set my bow in the cloud. It's talking about rainbows here. I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth. And it shall come to pass, when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the bow shall be seen in the cloud. Verse 15 up here. And I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall no more become a flood to destroy all flesh. And the bow, the rainbow, shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. And God said unto Noah, This is the token of the covenant, which I have established between me and all flesh that is upon the earth. We've seen a lot of symbolism in these couple of chapters. Before we looked at the dove and the olive branch, and I mentioned those are near universal symbols of peace. And the rainbow is the same. Rainbows are formed by sunlight diffracting through spherical raindrops. There's a lot of calculus and trigonometry involved there, so there's some interesting mathematics. Basically, the different periodic wavelengths of light, they're diffracted by a different amount, and hence they visually separate. And just like doves and olive branches appear all over the world as near universal symbols of peace, rainbows likewise, they appear all over the world. The token of this covenant is seen all over the world. And I really like the way God says it here in verse 16. He says, and the rainbow shall be in the cloud. And notice this here, and I will look upon it. God says, I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. God says, I'm going to look on it. And it's not that God needs that rainbow as a reminder like we do. Again, he doesn't forget like we do. He always remembers. He never forgets anything. But the point is, when I see that olive branch, or when I see that dove, or when I look up in the sky after a hard rain and I see that rainbow, I'm not the only person that sees that rainbow. God sees it too. He sees that rainbow because God sees everything. And it's a reminder to us that he always remembers his promises. And so the next time you're out hiking and you see a dove or you see an olive branch or a rainbow, remember, God's seeing that too. They're symbols of the peace we have with him if we believed in him. He's faithful even when we're not. He never forgets. He always keeps his promises. He always remembers to do good for his people. We'll continue our study of Genesis next time. Next time we'll probably start Abraham. I always close these videos with a brief prayer time. And so a few things I'm praying for right now. I'm praying for our country and its leaders to follow the Lord. We're coming up on a big election here in the United States, and so that's really important right now. I'm praying that Christians will give the gospel. I'm praying that new believers will grow, that new believers will see the tokens of these covenants that God has made with his people and God has made with the earth. So I'm going to take a few minutes and pray for these things. I hope that you will too. Until next time, I am Big Dave, the Parks Professor for Parking Full Time. Have a great afternoon, take care, and Lord bless.